Hey everyone, I'm Casey and I'm the founder of blogging.com. In this video, I'm going to discuss blog niche selection, basically how to choose your blogging niche. In my opinion, niche selection is arguably the most important part of creating a successful blog. So why don't we hear more bloggers talking about this? I think there's two main reasons. First, a lot of bloggers don't actually have a strategy when they first pick their niche. Even if they do run a successful blog, a lot of times their blog is about a hobby or passion or some specific interest that they pursued for an extended period of time. I think that the second reason is ultimately that the content created for bloggers by bloggers tends to lend itself to the stages where most bloggers are at. This would be when you're in the middle stages. You've created a blog, you've maybe done your first 20 posts, and you're sort of struggling. At this point, telling someone that they picked the wrong niche or that they should have evaluated the process differently is kind of insulting and just kind of not that useful. So, my theory is that's probably why this is not discussed a lot. But if you are in the process of picking a niche for your first blog, or you're possibly creating a new one, I think that this video will have a lot to offer in terms of niche selection. So first I'm going to go through some of the niches that you should avoid, especially if you're a beginner, because there are many niches that you should probably avoid. And it's good to just sort of get these out of the way before diving in to find a good niche. In fact, I would say it's easier to identify these bad niches sort of up front. So the first thing that you want to avoid are low RPM niches. And this is especially pertinent if you're trying to monetize your blog with display ads. If you pick a blog like gaming or pop culture or lifestyle, sometimes a lot of these niches have potential and there will be examples of outliers that do well, but a lot of times these don't have super high RPMs. So if your plan is only to monetize with ads, this probably isn't the best bet. You'd probably be better going after software, technology, high end sports, something related to luxury, real estate, something like that. The next niche that you want to avoid are overly competitive niches. Now, I know it feels like there are only competitive niches out there, meaning every topic has been touched on to some extent. But as we'll get into in the next section, that's not actually true. There are untapped niches and there are sub niches that can be expanded into full blown sites. But when I say overly competitive, we can broadly say that if a niche, if you search for, let's say, the article that you're planning on writing for a niche and you see the full first page of Google search results is full of articles with a near identical title, this is probably overly competitive. Now, the exception to this would be obviously if those were all low domain authority sites, because then you'd have a good chance of competing. But the best way to stand out and to make money fast is to find a niche that is not saturated. So ideally, you have some terms that are pretty much unique exclusively to your site. The third type of niche that you'd want to avoid are niches that are not brand safe. And this is, again, more of a display ad sort of concern, but it's true really for any form of monetization. If your website contains even just vague mentions of anything that Google or its advertising partners deem inappropriate or not brand safe, you might have a hard time getting approved. So, some of the examples I've seen over the years working with clients, um, occasionally someone will do like a pet niche site, which by itself is totally fine. But if you get really sort of graphic into, let's say, all the illnesses and medical conditions that a dog experiences. And you have, why is my dog, urinating all over the floor? Why is my dog vomiting? If you kind of gratuitously cover topics like that, especially mentioning things like blood, uh, it's really not it's not a good strategy. Ultimately, these sites will both be rejected, oftentimes by ad networks, or they'll just pay you a lot less. Advertisers do measure things like the number of these sort of high risk keywords that you have on your page. So it's definitely worth making sure that even if your niche is not explicitly not brand safe, that you're not focusing on topics that are also not brand safe. Also, some of the unexpected niches that you may not think of with this: if you do technology, you want to avoid anything like, you can have hacks or tips or tricks, but if we're literally talking about hacks or anything that violates intellectual property law or involves how to stream something for free illegally, that's anything like that is definitely a violation of for at least for Google. So you can't have content like that. um, you might be able to just delete a few articles if you have them like that, but it's better to avoid non-brand safe niches altogether. And the final sort of category that you want to avoid, and this is probably the most important, and there are a few caveats though, are YMYL niches. YMYL is just an acronym that stands for Your Money, Your Life. So basically, these are niches that affect usually personal finance or someone's well being. So if you have a personal finance site, if you have a medical site, if you have, there's a few other categories too. So if you have like a site purporting to show government information about voting, if you are claiming to be an authority in anything that typically has credentials, uh, let's say the legal arena, any of these topics are YMYL. And basically, these topics, Google explicitly states that they get extra scrutiny. And this makes a lot of sense. Do you really want someone who's not a doctor giving you medical advice online? That's probably why people tend to gravitate towards a site like WebMD, because they see it. Maybe they don't really know who's behind the article, but there's at least a veneer of, you know, legitimacy to it. You have people fact checking, you have people reviewing articles. Now, that's not to say that you can't do YMYL niches. Obviously, personal finance is a niche that a lot of people like. It's one I've considered going into many times. One of the things that stops me, though, is knowing that unless you have certain credentials, maybe you're a CPA, maybe you're a licensed investment advisor, or you just have decades of experience and have industry publications, it's going to be really hard to rank. You tend to need these things for a YMYL niche. So if you have one of these credentials, you can ignore this last point on the list. But even then, even if you have one of these credentials, I would not suggest necessarily just going for the YMYL niche. Google's not very good at figuring out who you are, what your site's about, or evaluating your credentials. So that shouldn't be your strategy, especially if you're a beginner. All of these, there are exceptions to if you're not a beginner. But as a beginner, these are all things that are going to make your blogging journey a lot more difficult. So now that we've talked about some of the not so good characteristics of a niche site, let's talk about the ideal characteristics. So first of all, you want to be narrow in scope. And there's a couple reasons for this. But generally speaking, the narrower your niche is, the easier it is to rank for different keywords because there's simply less competition. Usually the competition there is also less targeted, a little weaker. So as a newer site, it gives you better odds of outranking them. And it makes it easier to cover a topic in its entirety and basically achieve topical authority. The next characteristic is a low existing competition niche. Now, I know that almost every niche to some extent has coverage. This is generally true. I'm not disputing that. But there are some that have relatively low competition. Sometimes you have to get hyper specific for this, but they do exist. And I'll get to this in the next section, a little bit about how to find these. But another characteristic that would be ideal when considering a niche would be looking for something that's an up and coming topic. By this, I basically mean something that's either new or trending. So that might be in 2024. AI is obviously a very big topic. Lots of people who are, writing about AI are making lots of money. I've seen lots of YouTube channels that are entirely chat GPT tricks, and that's a good idea. So that'd be riding sort of that topical wave. Another example might be, you see this a lot in sports, especially with the decline of linear media. You have all these new sports being acquired by random private equity firms, and they end up on Netflix, or they end up being promoted in some new way. So Formula One racing is a good example. Saw sort of a boost from Netflix. Pickleball, while it's existed for a while, it has only really kind of gained mainstream popularity in the last 2 to 3 years. So these are examples of what I would call sort of up and coming niches. There's definitely a degree of luck when trying to get one of these. Obviously, both, like, for instance, the pickleball example and probably the AI example too are a little too competitive at this point to get into. In other words, cat's out of the bag on those. But if you can find something that's at that early inflection point of interest from a search perspective, you can definitely capitalize on that rising tide. That definitely happened with a few of my niche sites, and I think it's, if you're going to have multiple sites, I would try to catch a few of these trends. If nothing else, it's just a great way to get authority really fast because there's less competition. People will tend to link to you. You get backlinks effortlessly or at very low cost. So there's a lot of advantages. Another factor I'd look for is a niche that has multiple forms of content. So, yes, it's good to have a million articles potentially within a specific niche. But for me, if I were thinking about the future, I would be looking for something that lends itself to other types of media. So maybe having a visual component, whether that's like screenshots, infographics, step by step tutorials, video content, YouTube, podcasts. The future of digital media is obviously hard to predict, but the trend is definitely uh, having all these different ways to be able to distribute the media. So it's important to have multiple forms of content. This will give you some flexibility down the road. And this sort of leads into the last point, which is potential for social media marketing. So while I tend to focus on purely organic traffic from Google search, as a lot of people have begun doing, I've been exploring social media platforms as a source of traffic for my blogs over the past year. Partly because of things like the helpful content update, but really more just because it's good practice to have diverse sources of traffic, just like I like having diverse methods of monetization. So if you look for all these things, and you can even find one with one, maybe two of these characteristics, I'd say you have a pretty good potential with this niche. So now I'm going to go through 3 examples of different kind of ways to think about niche sites. These will also be 3 different niche site examples you could use. Note, I'm sure most of these have actually been covered, but these are just sort of off the top of my head. These are different ideas that I would go after. So the first one is basically the whole concept of niching down. So you have a broad niche like gardening. That's probably too competitive for a new blogger. I, there are always exceptions, but you generally shouldn't go after something like gardening. There are well established blogs, YouTube channels, and brands. Epic Gardening is an obvious one that comes to mind. So you got to get more specific than that. There's definitely subsets of gardening that these big brands haven't covered yet. So, one example, as someone who lives in the DC area might think of, is urban gardening. So, not everybody has a large yard, and plenty of people live in urban places. So, with the general sort of plant crazes, it would seem like there would be a rise in people looking for urban gardening. I've looked occasionally, I have a few plants, and I haven't seen a ton of resources really geared toward this market. There's some indoor plant stuff, but not so much stuff geared towards people actually living in an urban environment. So this could be the challenges you face, like irrigation or getting the right amount of sunlight, stuff like that. But even then, this is still probably fairly competitive. And ultimately, we want to have a pretty high RPM. So while skewing it towards an urban demographic is probably a good idea, an even better way to sort of increase the RPM effectively of this niche would be to sort of further double down and maybe go after affluent urban gardeners. So you might have, some this might lead to the final product being something like penthouse plants. And this is, again, just a purely conceptual idea, but I think this would make for a good niche. So, example number 2, which is sort of the concept of an intersection of interests. And this is pretty typical of the sites that I build. This is one topic meets another. So, I've used this example before on my websites. You might be familiar with it, but the concept I like to use is one that's you might have heard of, but it's a little obscure, but called stealth wealth. So just quick primer. Stealth wealth refers to the practice of maintaining a high net worth or substantial financial success while not displaying overt signs of wealth. So basically, it's kind of the intersection of, well, stealth or privacy and wealth, personal finance. So these are both 2 big topics. You could write, obviously, a blog about each of these just on its own. In fact, you could write one on each of sort of the main tenets that I outlined in the Venn diagram in the slide. But ultimately, if I'm doing an intersection of interest type niche, I'm looking for topics that are in the middle of that Venn diagram that contain both areas. So, both personal finance and privacy. Because obviously, there are some areas where these overlap. For example, if somebody is basically not sure, maybe they're like there's a big movement, the financial independence and early retirement movement, FIRE. So if somebody's basically early retired, they've probably had a fair amount of financial success, but they might have questions about, like, well, how do I explain to somebody I'm dating that I'm like retired 20 years earlier than the average person? I see questions like this on Reddit all the time and other subs where people talk about these sort of things. And these are good questions. Again, not saying this has mass appeal, but there's definitely an audience for that, and it's definitely interesting to read about. So that would be an example of something that fits into the overlapping portion of the Venn diagram. So example number 3 is sort of a hybrid niche blog add-on. This is something I bring up mainly because you might be watching this and you might have an existing job or business, and this is a great way to add the blog on and find those synergies together. So, 3 examples. The first might be you build a custom calculator. Maybe you're like an accountant and you have, you're playing around with building a mortgage calculator. So, you have this interesting tool, you build a website around it, and maybe it's generating a fair amount of traffic. Tools like that are really useful, they get a lot of clicks. But as you probably have discovered, it's hard to get these tools by themselves accepted into the premium display ad networks. So usually they have very low RPMs. They're stuck on Google AdSense. But if you built a blog around that, let's say you did a whole, I don't know, 300 posts going on sort of about various long tail keywords related to all the queries around your calculator, like how much interest am I paying over the lifetime of my mortgage, and just kind of go through all those different topics. And either you or someone else you partner with write out the answers. And you can get that traffic to become at least, let's say, 75% of the total traffic that the site receives. You can probably get that site accepted by a display ad network. And again, you don't have to even do this yourself. You can find someone like me who is willing to, you know, basically build the blog and split the upside with you. So this is a good example. Another example, which this one might be a little less common, but if you're a local business owner, meaning you have like a physical local business, you might be, let's say, like a locksmith. You might think that, your earnings are kind of limited just to the actual business you operate, but you can add on a blog and sort of leverage your real authority and write about various topics like that can generate both leads but also ad revenue. So you could go down sort of all the topics related to what are the best locks, how do I secure X, Y, and Z, what size should my deadbolt be, any topic related to your service. And again, you'll get both leads and potentially some display ad income. So tacking that blog on to your local business website would be a good idea. Another way you can do this, and I mention this because it lends itself to pretty much anybody, is an e-commerce blog. You might be like, well, Casey, I don't have an e-commerce store, but anyone can start an e-commerce store. In fact, I've been getting a lot of questions since the helpful content update, since a lot of people observed that e-commerce stores seem to have fared better throughout this search engine volatility. The theory is if you just create a bogus e-commerce store and tack on a blog, that your blog might rank better. Is this true? Maybe. But the better answer would be to actually just build a real e-commerce store with products that you don't need to physically own, and add a blog to it. So whether they're products that you're drop shipping, whether they're digital downloads, these are all things that you can create, you can outsource or make arrangements for. So you do have a real functioning e-commerce store, but you also have this nice blog that's attached to it, and you can go after any related keywords. The other reason that this third one especially is a good example is these are non-YMYL topics, but they're also very high RPM potentially. So if you have a print on demand business and you do you write about sort of the meta concept of print on demand as a subject. Print on demand is a very high RPM niche. So if you attract advertisers related to that, and you will if your content is exclusively about that, that can be a great way to monetize an e-commerce blog. So as you can see, this whole model of basically taking a tool or existing service and adding a niche blog onto it is another way that you can find sort of a unique niche that works for you. Thanks for watching my video on blog niche selection. I hope you have a little bit better of an idea of how to choose your blogging niche. I've included links to some of the relevant articles I've written in the video notes. But if you have more questions, you can also check out bloggingguide.com. It's where I write about a lot of my blogging tips, tricks, and advice. I also have a Substack newsletter, bloggingguide.substack.com. And you can always reach out to me through my personal website, caseybotticello.com, or through social media at caseybotticello. Thanks for watching, and if you found this video useful, please consider liking and subscribing.